They thought humiliating a quiet woman in first class would entertain the wealthy passengers around them. But none of them realized they were about to insult the wife of the man who owned the entire airline. The polished marble floors of Reagan National Airport reflected the warm glow of the evening lights as Claire Bennett walked calmly through Terminal C with a small cream-colored carry-on rolling quietly behind her. At 36, Claire carried herself with a softness that made people underestimate her almost instantly. Her light brown hair was tied into a simple low ponytail, and she wore white sneakers, dark jeans, and a loose gray sweater that looked more comfortable than expensive. Nothing about her appearance suggested private wealth, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Around her, business travelers rushed through the terminal dragging designer luggage while overhead speakers announced delayed departures and boarding calls. Claire glanced down at her boarding pass for Aurora Air Flight 728 to Los Angeles before slipping it back into her purse with practiced calm. First class. Seat 2A. A few feet away, a sharply dressed man in a navy suit accidentally bumped shoulders with her before immediately frowning at her clothes. "Watch it," he muttered coldly before continuing toward the priority lane. Claire simply smiled faintly and kept walking. She had spent years learning that dignity was often quieter than arrogance. As she approached the exclusive first-class boarding area, a young gate agent scanned her ticket without issue, but the moment Claire stepped onto the aircraft, the atmosphere shifted. The first-class cabin glowed with soft amber lighting, polished wood accents, and oversized cream leather seats. A flight attendant named Vanessa Cole stood near the entrance greeting premium passengers with polished professionalism. Tall, blonde, and immaculately styled, Vanessa wore the kind of sharp smile that looked warm from a distance but cold up close. "Welcome aboard," she began automatically before her eyes traveled over Claire's sweater and sneakers. The smile faded almost instantly. Claire offered her boarding pass politely. "Hi there." Vanessa took the ticket, her perfectly manicured nails pausing mid-motion as she read the seat number. A subtle crease formed between her brows. "Oh," she said slowly. "I think there may be a mistake." Claire blinked softly. "A mistake?" Vanessa glanced toward the spacious first-class cabin where wealthy passengers settled into champagne service and noise-canceling headphones. Then she lowered her voice just enough to sound insulting without technically raising it. First-class passengers usually board through the priority entrance downstairs. Claire nodded politely. "Yes, I came through priority boarding." Vanessa looked unconvinced. Behind Claire, another passenger waiting in the aisle let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe she wandered in from coach," a man muttered under his breath. A few nearby travelers smirked without looking up directly. Claire felt the familiar heat of public judgment beginning to build around her, but her voice remained calm. "My seat is 2A." Vanessa stared at the boarding pass again before forcing another thin smile. "Ma'am, these seats are reserved for premium clients." The businessman seated across the aisle glanced over his newspaper with amusement dancing in his eyes. "Honey," he chuckled loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Coach is in the back." Quiet laughter rippled through the first-class section. Claire stood frozen for a brief moment, fingers tightening gently around the strap of her purse as dozens of eyes drifted toward her. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, and somewhere far behind the polished smiles and expensive watches, humiliation quietly began to settle into the cabin like turbulence before a storm. Claire forced herself to maintain a polite smile even as the tension around her thickened. The businessman who had mocked her leaned farther into the aisle, loosening his silk tie as though he had just delivered the funniest line of the evening. "These airlines really need stricter boarding policies," he said loudly, earning another ripple of quiet amusement from nearby passengers sipping champagne from crystal glasses. Vanessa folded Claire's boarding pass carefully and handed it back with controlled impatience. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside while we sort this out." Claire accepted the ticket slowly. "There is nothing to sort out. I purchased this seat 3 weeks ago." Vanessa tilted her head slightly, the professional mask beginning to crack beneath irritation. "First-class passengers are usually part of our executive rewards program or corporate clients." Claire blinked once. "And?" Vanessa exhaled through her nose. "And your appearance is creating confusion." The words landed softly, but the humiliation behind them hit like ice water. Several passengers nearby suddenly became very interested in their phones while continuing to listen carefully. One older woman near the window frowned uncomfortably, but said nothing. Claire felt dozens of eyes moving across her sweater, her worn white sneakers, her simple ponytail. The entire cabin had quietly decided what kind of woman she must be. Vanessa gestured toward the aisle behind her. Why do not we avoid making this uncomfortable? Claire looked at her steadily. You already have. For the first time, Vanessa's expression hardened completely. The warmth vanished from her voice. Ma'am, if you do not cooperate, I will need to involve airport security. A hush settled over the cabin. Even the businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly, sensing the confrontation escalating into entertainment. Claire swallowed carefully, refusing to let emotion rise into her voice. I have done nothing wrong. Then you should have no issue verifying your information downstairs, Vanessa replied sharply. The businessman chuckled again. This is exactly why ticket prices keep going up. A younger passenger quietly lifted his phone beneath his jacket, recording the exchange. Claire noticed, but said nothing. Years earlier, moments like this would have shattered her confidence. Before Ethan. Before the foundation. Before she learned that wealth often revealed more ugliness in others than kindness. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound threatening instead of loud. Please do not make this harder on yourself. Claire stared at her for a long moment. Then, without anger, she reached for the handle of her carry-on suitcase. The silence inside the first-class cabin became almost painful as she slowly turned and began walking toward the rear of the aircraft. The sound of her suitcase wheels clicking against the floor echoed through the aisle with humiliating clarity. Nobody moved. Nobody defended her. People simply watched. Some with curiosity, some with satisfaction, others with the quiet relief that public embarrassment was happening to someone else instead of them. Vanessa followed several feet behind like an escort removing an unwanted guest from an exclusive event. Claire kept her chin level, but her cheeks burned beneath the soft cabin lights. Halfway down the aisle, she passed a little girl seated beside her mother in business class. The child looked up innocently and whispered, "Mom, why are they making her leave?" The mother quickly hushed her without answering. Claire felt something tighten painfully in her chest. Not anger, disappointment. The kind that came when human beings failed simple tests of kindness. As she finally reached the galley near the middle of the plane, Vanessa crossed her arms. You can wait here while security comes aboard. Claire looked out the small, oval window into the darkening Washington evening beyond the runway lights. Then she calmly reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number from memory. Vanessa watched with growing annoyance as Claire lifted the phone to her ear. After 2 rings, a man answered warmly. Claire's voice remained soft and steady. Hey, I think there is a problem on your flight. Vanessa narrowed her eyes as Claire lowered the phone from her ear with quiet composure. I hope you are not calling someone to create a scene, she said coldly. Claire slipped the phone back into her purse. No, she answered softly. I called my husband. The businessman in the first-class cabin laughed loud enough for several rows to hear. Let me guess, he called out mockingly. Your husband is a senator too? More restrained laughter followed from nearby passengers. Claire did not respond. She simply stood near the galley window watching baggage crews move beneath the floodlights outside while the aircraft remained parked at the gate. Vanessa checked the time impatiently before pressing a button on the intercom phone mounted beside the service counter. This is Vanessa in first class, she said quietly. I still need airport security assistance for a passenger issue. A pause followed. Then her expression changed slightly. What do you mean delayed? The voice on the other end spoke rapidly enough that Claire could not hear the details, but Vanessa's posture stiffened almost immediately. What kind of operations call? She asked. For this flight. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Claire before she quickly turned away. The businessman across the aisle noticed the shift instantly. Everything all right up there? He asked with amusement still lingering in his voice. Vanessa forced a smile. Just a small delay, sir. But something had changed. The sharp confidence she carried moments earlier now looked thinner somehow. Around the cabin, passengers began checking watches and phones as murmurs spread quietly between rows. One flight attendant emerged from the cockpit looking confused. Vanessa, she whispered urgently. Operations just locked the passenger manifest. Vanessa frowned. Locked it? What? I do not know. The captain said executive headquarters flagged the flight personally. Claire remained silent. She neither smiled nor reacted. That calmness unsettled Vanessa more than anger would have. A few moments later, the intercom phone rang again. Vanessa answered quickly. Yes. Her face drained of color. No, she is still on board. Silence. Yes, of course. Another silence. Understood. She hung up slowly. The businessman folded his newspaper down completely now, sensing the atmosphere changing in ways he did not understand. What is going on? He asked. Vanessa ignored him and turned toward Claire with a stiffness that bordered on panic. Ma'am. The words sounded different now. Smaller. Careful. Claire looked at her patiently. Yes. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since Claire boarded the aircraft, she seemed unsure of herself. One of the younger flight attendants approached holding a tablet with trembling hands. Vanessa, she whispered, you need to see this. On the screen was the updated passenger profile connected to seat 2A. A red executive banner stretched across the display. Family of owner. Do not remove or reassign under any circumstance. Vanessa stared at the words as if they might disappear if she blinked hard enough. Her throat tightened visibly. This cannot be right, she muttered. But deep down, she already knew it was. The younger attendant swallowed nervously. Operations said the chairman himself is on his way to the gate. The room seemed to lose sound for a moment. Even the cabin chatter softened into uneasy silence. The businessman who had mocked Claire sat upright now, his confident smirk slowly fading. Vanessa looked toward Claire again, finally seeing her differently. Not because of wealth, not because of power, but because Claire had never once raised her voice, never once insulted anyone back. The dignity in that silence suddenly felt unbearable. Outside the aircraft windows, flashing airport carts rolled across the tarmac beneath the dark Virginia sky, while tension quietly spread through the cabin like approaching turbulence. Then, a few seconds later, the main boarding door opened again. Every head in first class turned toward the entrance at exactly the same moment. The moment the boarding door opened, the energy inside the aircraft shifted completely. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped onto the plane accompanied by two senior airport executives wearing dark navy suits with Aurora Air badges pinned to their lapels. Conversation stopped instantly. Even the faint clinking of champagne glasses seemed to disappear into the heavy silence settling across the cabin. Ethan Bennett moved with calm authority, his expression unreadable as his sharp blue eyes scanned the first-class section. At 42, Ethan carried the kind of presence money alone could never buy. Not loud, not theatrical, just absolute certainty. The senior executives behind him looked visibly tense, exchanging nervous glances as they followed him into the cabin. Vanessa straightened so quickly she nearly dropped the tablet, still trembling in her hands. Mr. Bennett, she stammered. Softly. Ethan did not answer her immediately. His eyes had already found Claire standing quietly near the galley with one hand resting on the handle of her suitcase. The moment he saw her face, something subtle changed in his expression. Not anger. Disappointment. The kind that cuts deeper because it arrives quietly. He walked toward her slowly while the entire cabin watched in silence. Claire gave him a small apologetic smile. I am sorry, she said gently. I know you are busy. Ethan stopped beside her and touched her hand softly. Are you all right? Claire nodded once. I am fine. But Ethan noticed the faint redness around her eyes and the humiliation she was trying carefully to hide. He looked around the cabin again. The businessman who had mocked her suddenly became deeply interested in adjusting his cufflinks. Vanessa swallowed hard as Ethan finally turned toward her. Who removed my wife from her seat? His voice remained calm. That calmness terrified the crew more than shouting ever could. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Sir, I believe there had been a misunderstanding regarding seating assignments. Ethan held her gaze steadily. My wife showed a valid boarding pass. Vanessa's composure cracked further. Yes, sir. So why was she standing in the aisle with airport security being called? No one moved. No one breathed loudly. The businessman in seat 3C slowly lowered his eyes toward the carpet beneath him as realization spread across the cabin like wildfire. Ethan glanced briefly toward him. Did you enjoy humiliating her? The man froze completely. Sir, I did not realize, Ethan interrupted quietly. That is usually when character matters most. When you think no one important is watching. The room went silent again. One of the executives behind Ethan shifted nervously and whispered something to the captain standing near the cockpit door. Vanessa looked as though the floor beneath her had disappeared. "Mr. Bennett, I deeply apologize. I was attempting to protect the experience of our premium passengers." Claire finally spoke before Ethan could respond. "Vanessa." The flight attendant looked up immediately. Claire's voice remained soft, almost kind. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Vanessa blinked rapidly, unable to answer. Claire glanced around the luxurious cabin with its leather seats, polished wood trim, and expensive champagne resting untouched beside embarrassed passengers. "It was not being removed from my seat," she said quietly. "It was how quickly people decided I did not belong." Several passengers lowered their heads. The businessman's face flushed dark red beneath the cabin lights. Ethan looked at Claire with unmistakable admiration before turning back toward the executives. "Suspend boarding," he said calmly. "I want a full incident report before this aircraft leaves the gate." Vanessa's face drained completely. One of the executives nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." Ethan then looked toward the passengers seated throughout first class. "Aurora Air was built on service," he said evenly, "not status obsession." Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Because somewhere between the polished luxury and expensive silence, everyone on board had just realized the simplest woman in the cabin had been the one carrying the most dignity all along. The silence inside the cabin lingered long after Ethan Bennett finished speaking. Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Nobody laughed. The atmosphere that had once felt polished and exclusive now felt painfully fragile, as though one honest moment had exposed something ugly beneath the luxury. Claire remained beside Ethan near the center galley while airport executives quietly moved around them, making urgent phone calls. Vanessa stood frozen a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform as if she were trying to hold herself together. The confidence she carried earlier had completely disappeared. Ethan turned toward Claire softly. "You should sit down." Claire shook her head slightly. "Not yet." Her eyes drifted across the cabin. Some passengers avoided eye contact entirely. Others looked openly ashamed. The businessman who had mocked her earlier finally cleared his throat awkwardly before standing from his seat. "Mrs. Bennett," he began carefully, "I think I owe you an apology." Claire looked at him quietly. The man struggled beneath the weight of his own embarrassment. Just 20 minutes earlier, he had smirked at her like she was beneath him. Now his voice sounded small. "I made assumptions," he admitted. "That was wrong." Claire studied him for a moment before giving a faint nod. "Thank you." Nothing more. No speech. No cruelty. Somehow that simple grace made the moment even heavier. Nearby, the older woman seated by the window lowered her eyes with visible regret. "I should have said something," she whispered softly to herself. One of the younger flight attendants standing near the galley suddenly wiped tears from her eyes before stepping toward Claire nervously. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I am really sorry for what happened." Claire offered her a gentle smile. "You were not the one humiliating people." The young attendant looked down immediately, ashamed anyway. Ethan watched his wife carefully, admiration mixing with sadness in his expression. Over the years, he had seen this happen too many times. Restaurants, charity events, luxury stores. People saw simple clothes and immediately decided someone's value. Claire had always handled it with dignity, but Ethan knew those moments still hurt her every single time. One of the executives approached Ethan holding a tablet. "Sir, the incident report has already been initiated. Human Resources is requesting immediate review authority." Vanessa's face turned pale again. Ethan glanced briefly toward her, then back toward the executive. "Good." Vanessa swallowed hard before finally stepping forward herself. Her voice trembled noticeably now. "Mrs. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. I truly am sorry." Claire looked at her carefully. Vanessa's mascara had begun to blur slightly near the corners of her eyes, though she was trying desperately to remain composed. "I have worked for this airline for 11 years, Vanessa said softly. "I thought I understood premium service." Claire answered gently. "Premium service is not about deciding who deserves respect." The words landed harder than any insult ever could. Vanessa lowered her head completely. The room remained silent once again. Outside the windows, rain had started, falling lightly across the runway, soft streaks sliding down the glass beneath the airport lights. Ethan finally took Claire's suitcase handle from her hand. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let us go home." Several passengers looked stunned. "You are not taking the flight?" one man asked. Ethan glanced around the cabin one final time. "Not tonight." Claire rested her hand softly against Ethan's arm as they slowly began walking back toward the aircraft door together. This time, nobody looked at her with judgment. People moved aside respectfully as she passed. The same aisle that had witnessed her humiliation now sat completely silent beneath the weight of shame. As Claire reached the doorway, she paused briefly and looked back once more at the cabin full of expensive seats and lowered eyes. "The saddest part," she said softly, "is that kindness would have cost nothing." Nobody had a response for that, because deep down, every person on board knew she was right. Rain continued falling softly over Reagan National Airport as Claire and Ethan Bennett stepped out of the aircraft bridge into the nearly empty terminal. Behind them, Aurora Air Flight 728 remained parked at the gate, while confused passengers sat in uneasy silence waiting for updates that nobody seemed willing to explain clearly. The polished terminal lights reflected across the wet windows as airport employees hurried quietly through the corridors whispering to one another. News of what happened on board had already begun spreading through airport operations faster than anyone expected. Claire walked beside Ethan calmly, her small carry-on rolling behind her while he kept one hand gently resting against the middle of her back. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The quiet between them felt heavier than anger. Ethan finally exhaled slowly. "I should have never let that happen to you." Claire looked up at him immediately. "You did not." He shook his head faintly. "It is my airline. That means it is my responsibility." Claire understood why he felt that way. Ethan had spent 20 years building Aurora Air into one of the most respected airlines in the country, not through flashy advertisements or luxury branding alone, but through a company culture he believed valued dignity and service above status. Yet somewhere along the way, people inside the system had started confusing wealth with worth. They reached a quiet private lounge overlooking the rain-soaked runway, where one of Ethan's executives waited nervously beside a conference table. The man stood the moment they entered. "Mr. Bennett." Ethan nodded once. "Tell me." The executive swallowed carefully before opening a tablet filled with reports already flooding in from the incident. Several passengers recorded the confrontation, he admitted quietly. "Clips are already appearing online." Claire closed her eyes briefly. Not from fear. From exhaustion. Ethan's jaw tightened subtly. "And Vanessa?" "She has been temporarily suspended pending investigation." Ethan remained silent for a long moment before answering. "This is bigger than one employee." The executive nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." Claire slowly sat near the large airport windows, watching runway lights blur through the falling rain outside. "People do not suddenly become cruel overnight," she said softly. Both men turned toward her. Claire folded her hands gently in her lap. "They become comfortable deciding who deserves kindness." The room fell silent again. Ethan looked at his wife carefully. Even now, after everything, she was not asking for revenge, not demanding punishment. That was who Claire had always been. Years earlier, before Ethan became a billionaire, they had met at a small non-profit fundraiser where Claire volunteered every weekend tutoring underprivileged children. She had treated janitors, donors, servers, and executives with the exact same warmth. That quiet dignity was the reason Ethan fell in love with her long before success changed their lives. The executive shifted awkwardly. "Public relations is recommending a statement first thing tomorrow morning." Ethan looked toward the rain beyond the glass. "Good." Then his voice lowered slightly. "But I do not want a polished corporate apology." The executive blinked. "Sir." Ethan turned back slowly. "I want every employee in this company retrained on what respect actually means." The executive immediately nodded. "Yes, sir." Claire looked at Ethan with soft surprise. He gave her a faint smile. Luxury service means nothing if basic humanity disappears. For the first time that night, Claire's eyes warmed slightly. Somewhere far across the runway, an aircraft lifted into the dark sky, its lights disappearing into the storm clouds above Washington. Ethan walked over and sat beside his wife quietly. Neither of them cared about first-class seats anymore. Not after what the evening had revealed. Claire rested her head gently against his shoulder while airport lights shimmered through the rain outside the lounge windows. And somewhere behind the expensive terminals, polished cabins, and designer suits. An entire airline had just been reminded that true class could never be purchased. By the following morning, the story had spread far beyond Reagan National Airport. Clips recorded by passengers onboard Flight 728 flooded social media feeds across the country. Millions of people watched the same painful moment unfold again and again. Claire Bennett standing quietly beside her suitcase, while wealthy passengers stared. Vanessa calling security. The businessman laughing from his first-class seat. Then the sudden silence after Ethan Bennett stepped onto the aircraft. News stations replayed the footage beside headlines questioning how luxury airlines treated ordinary customers. Comment sections exploded with outrage. Some viewers recognized Claire immediately from charity events connected to the Bennett Foundation, an organization that had quietly funded scholarships, food programs, and children's hospitals for years without seeking publicity. Others focused on something simpler: the fact that nobody defended her when they thought she was powerless. Inside Aurora Air headquarters in downtown Washington, executives filled the top conference room before sunrise. The atmosphere felt tense beneath the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the city skyline. Ethan stood at the front of the room beside a large monitor displaying screenshots from the incident. Nobody dared speak casually. "This is not a public relations problem," Ethan said calmly. "This is a culture problem." The room remained silent. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while legal advisors exchanged nervous glances. Ethan pressed a remote, and another image appeared on the screen. Claire standing alone in the aisle while passengers watched her humiliation unfold. "Every employee in this company has been trained to recognize premium customers," Ethan continued quietly. "But somewhere along the line, we stopped teaching people how to recognize human dignity." No one argued, because deep down, they knew he was right. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire sat quietly inside the Bennett Foundation offices helping prepare school supply packages for underprivileged children exactly as she did every Friday morning. The volunteers around her kept glancing nervously at their phones where her face dominated the news. Finally, one young volunteer looked up carefully. "Mrs. Bennett," she asked softly, "how are you not angry?" Claire paused while folding notebooks into a cardboard box. Sunlight filtered through the office windows across her gray sweater and tired eyes. "I was angry last night," she admitted gently. "But anger alone never changes people." The young volunteer frowned slightly. "Then what does?" Claire looked down at the small backpack in her hands before answering. "Sometimes shame does. Sometimes kindness does. Sometimes people simply need to see themselves clearly for the first time." Back at Aurora Air headquarters, Vanessa Cole sat alone inside a human resources office waiting for the final review of her employment status. Her once perfect posture had collapsed into quiet exhaustion. On the desk in front of her sat hundreds of printed customer comments condemning her behavior. Yet the words hurting her most did not come from strangers online. They came from Claire. Premium service is not about deciding who deserves respect. Vanessa replayed that sentence in her mind over and over again. The door opened softly, and one of the senior executives stepped inside, holding a folder. Vanessa immediately stood up, her throat tightening. But the executive surprised her. "Mrs. Bennett requested something before the review concludes," he said carefully. Vanessa blinked in confusion. "What?" The executive hesitated briefly. "She requested that we offer retraining before termination." Vanessa stared at him speechless. "Why would she do that after what I did?" The executive gave a faint shake of his head. "According to Mrs. Bennett, humiliation should not become a cycle." Vanessa slowly sat back down, tears finally slipping down her face for the first time since the incident began. Somewhere beyond the glass walls of the corporate tower, airplanes crossed the bright morning sky, carrying thousands of strangers toward destinations they had not reached yet. And in that moment, Vanessa realized the quiet woman she humiliated possessed something rarer than power: grace. 3 weeks after the incident onboard Flight 728, Aurora Air launched a company-wide initiative called the Dignity Standard. Every employee from executives to gate agents attended mandatory retraining sessions focused not on luxury branding or premium sales strategies, but on empathy, respect, and unconscious bias. Videos from the incident continued circulating online, though public opinion had shifted in an unexpected direction. What people discussed most was no longer the humiliation itself. It was Claire Bennett's response afterward. News anchors replayed her quiet words about kindness costing nothing. Social media users shared clips of Ethan defending her calmly, without arrogance or threats. Millions of viewers commented on the same thing. The wealthiest people in the story had behaved with the most humility. Inside a training center near Aurora Air headquarters, dozens of employees sat silently watching the footage from Flight 728 projected across a large screen. Vanessa Cole sat in the back row wearing a simple gray blazer instead of her flight attendant uniform. Since the incident, she had barely recognized herself. The woman on the screen looked polished and professional, yet cold in ways she had never noticed before. Every expression, every dismissive glance, every assumption, it all looked painfully clear now. The instructor paused the video on the moment Claire stood alone in the aisle clutching her suitcase, while passengers watched silently. "What failed here?" the instructor asked the room quietly. One employee raised his hand carefully. "Customer service." The instructor shook her head. "No," another answered. "Protocol." Again, the instructor shook her head. Then she pointed toward the frozen image of Claire, standing humiliated beneath the cabin lights. Humanity failed here. The room went silent. Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. Hours later, after the session ended, Vanessa stepped outside the training center into the cool afternoon air, feeling emotionally drained. She expected judgment everywhere now. Whispers, stares, anger. Instead, she saw a familiar figure standing quietly near the parking lot holding 2 paper coffee cups. Claire Bennett. Vanessa froze completely. Claire walked toward her calmly and offered one of the coffees. "I remembered you like vanilla lattes," she said softly. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief before accepting the cup with trembling hands. "Why are you being kind to me?" she whispered. Claire gave a faint smile. "Because somebody has to stop this cycle somewhere." Vanessa's eyes filled instantly. "I humiliated you in front of an entire cabin." Claire nodded gently. "Yes." Vanessa looked down, ashamed. "I thought I understood people." Claire took a slow sip from her coffee before answering. "Most people judge others by what makes them feel safe. Expensive clothes, status, wealth, familiarity." She looked toward the airplanes crossing the bright afternoon sky overhead. "But dignity is harder, because it asks us to respect people before they prove their value." Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. "I do not know if I deserve forgiveness." Claire answered quietly. "Forgiveness and accountability are not enemies." The wind moved softly through the parking lot as jets roared faintly in the distance. Vanessa looked at the woman she once believed did not belong in first class and realized something painful. Claire never needed first class to prove who she was. She carried grace into every room long before anyone knew her last name. Across the city, Ethan Bennett sat inside a corporate interview where reporters repeatedly asked how he planned to repair Aurora Air's public image. Ethan simply answered, "You do not repair trust with advertisements. You repair it with behavior." That statement spread online almost as quickly as the original incident itself. But back in the parking lot beneath the fading afternoon sun, none of that mattered much to Claire. She stood quietly beside the woman who once humiliated her and offered compassion anyway. And for Vanessa Cole, that kindness became the most uncomfortable lesson of all. 6 months later, Aurora Air looked different in ways most passengers could not immediately explain. The aircraft cabins were still elegant. The first-class lounges still served expensive champagne beneath warm lighting and polished marble floors. But something quieter had changed beneath the luxury. Employees greeted travelers more carefully now. Gate agents no longer judged passengers by designer bags or tailored suits alone. Flight attendants paid attention to nervous elderly travelers, exhausted parents, and people dressed simply but carrying themselves with quiet dignity. Inside the company, people referred to it as the Claire effect, though Claire herself hated that name every time she heard it. On a crisp autumn evening in Chicago, Claire Bennett once again boarded an Aurora Air flight wearing comfortable jeans, white sneakers, and a soft gray sweater. Her appearance had not changed at all. She still looked like the kind of woman wealthy people often overlooked in airports every single day. But this time, something remarkable happened. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, a young flight attendant smiled warmly and said, "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Bennett." Claire smiled politely. "Please," she answered gently. "Claire is fine." The flight attendant nodded nervously. "Of course." Claire settled quietly into her seat near the window while passengers around her organized briefcases and laptops for the evening flight to Seattle. Outside, runway lights stretched into the darkening horizon beneath a sky painted deep orange and blue. A few rows behind Claire sat a woman in her late 60s wearing faded sneakers and an old denim jacket. She clutched her boarding pass anxiously while another passenger beside her sighed impatiently at the sight of her struggling to place a worn carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. Before the older woman could apologize, the young flight attendant immediately stepped forward with a warm smile. "Allow me to help you with that, ma'am." The older woman looked relieved instantly. "Thank you, sweetheart." Claire watched quietly from her seat as the attendant carefully stored the bag without the slightest trace of judgment on her face. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but Claire felt something soften in her chest anyway, because real change rarely arrived through grand speeches. It revealed itself in ordinary moments when people finally chose kindness instead of assumptions. Midway through the flight, Ethan appeared briefly from the cockpit area after speaking with the captain. Several passengers recognized him immediately and whispered excitedly among themselves, but Ethan ignored the attention completely. His eyes found Claire first, just like they always did. He sat beside her for a moment while cabin lights dimmed softly around them. "You are smiling," he noticed quietly. Claire glanced toward the older woman now comfortably asleep beneath a folded airline blanket. "Things are changing," she whispered. Ethan followed her gaze and understood immediately. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The steady hum of the aircraft filled the silence while city lights glittered far below the clouds beneath them. Finally, Ethan looked at Claire carefully. "You know," he said softly, "most people would have responded very differently after what happened." Claire rested her head lightly against the seat and stared out the dark airplane window. "Humiliating people does not heal humiliation," she answered. Ethan smiled faintly. The cabin remained peaceful for the rest of the flight. No arrogance, no spectacle, just strangers traveling through the night sky together. And somewhere above the clouds, inside a first-class cabin that once exposed the worst in people, kindness had quietly begun teaching them who they could become instead. Because that night months earlier was never really about wealth, power, or luxury seats. It was about the dangerous habit of deciding someone's worth before hearing their voice. And on that flight, an entire cabin learned that real class has never been about where you sit. It is about how you make others feel when they stand beside you.